Hey friends, tonight we begin with the sound of silence under a star-soaked sky. The kind of silence so complete you can hear your own heartbeat echoing against eternity. Abram, still called that for now, stands barefoot on the sands of Ur, staring at constellations that his ancestors used to chart trade routes and predict harvests. But tonight, those same stars whisper something else, something personal. A voice, ancient yet intimate, cuts through the still air. It isn't thunder, it isn't wind, it's a call, a promise, a demand. So, before we start, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy stories that connect faith to wealth. That's what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The voice tells Abram to leave everything, his country, his family, his father's household, and to go to a land God would show him. It sounds poetic when read centuries later, but imagine it now. You're standing beside your family's business empire. Camels stacked with fine textiles, storage jars full of grain and silver, contracts inked with merchants from Elam to Mari. And then a disembodied command says, "Walk away." Historians still argue whether Abram was a real merchant prince or just a semi-nomadic herder with ambition. Either way, he had a lot to lose. In Mesopotamia, land meant legacy. Leaving was financial suicide. Yet something in that voice carried an authority no human logic could balance against. So Abram did the unthinkable. He started selling things off. He packed tents instead of deeds. People whispered that he'd gone mad. Some said he'd joined a cult. Others said he'd been promised new land grants by a foreign king. But Abram didn't explain. He couldn't. Try telling your accountant that your next investment strategy is follow a mysterious voice into the desert. Sarai watched, patient but skeptical. Her jewellery glinted in the morning sun as servants loaded camels. Lot, his nephew, insisted on tagging along. Every family has that one cousin who just won't stay behind when adventure calls. When they finally set out, the air felt thick with expectation and fear. The caravan stretched like a silver thread across the plain. Each hoofbeat was a drumbeat of faith, and also, let's be honest, mild panic. The Bible says Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But belief didn't cancel hunger. It didn't calm the doubts that came at night when the winds moaned through the tents. He wondered if he'd misheard. Maybe the voice meant something metaphorical, not literal. But every time he looked at the stars, he remembered. The voice hadn't promised comfort. It had promised greatness. The journey wasn't glamorous. Sandstorms swallowed entire weeks. Merchants sneered when he passed. There goes Abram, the man who traded stability for whispers. Yet in the strangest twist, his flocks grew. His servants multiplied. It was as though invisible dividends followed him. Culturally, Mesopotamian religion treated gods like vending machines. Offer sacrifices, get rain. But Abram's new God didn't bargain. He just said, go. That was revolutionary. Some scholars suggest Abram's leap of faith marks the birth of personal covenant. The idea that relationship with the divine could transform destiny without temple intermediaries. By the time Abram reached Haran, he was already wealthier than when he'd left. Faith hadn't shrunk his fortune. It had reshaped its purpose. He began to see wealth not as security but as a tool. Gold bought loyalty. Herds fed followers. Influence could now serve promise, not pride. At night he would climb a hill, stare at the moon, and whisper, "If this is madness, let it be holy madness." Sarai nearby would sigh, half in affection, half in worry. Lot snored loudly, dreaming of profits. The desert wasn't empty. It was alive with meaning. Every gust of wind was a test. Every dawn was a fresh spreadsheet of faith and risk. Financial reflection. What this means for your own wealth journey. Sometimes the richest investments begin with a step that makes no financial sense. True wealth starts where comfort ends. Faith-based ventures, whether business or life choices, demand courage to leave the predictable. Abram's story reminds us that the unknown isn't a void, it's often the frontier of divine opportunity. When they left Haran, the morning air smelled of smoke and livestock, a caravan city waking up to trade. Abram turned back once, his gaze lingering on the bustling markets. This was safety. This was structure. Haran was a hub on the ancient Silk Road of its day, where merchants from Anatolia, Babylon and Canaan traded copper, wool and silver. Walking away from that was like quitting Wall Street to follow a whisper in the wind. Sarai adjusted her headscarf, pretending not to notice her husband's hesitation. Lot, ever the optimist, grinned and said, "Uncle, maybe the new land has fewer taxes." Even the camels groaned like they knew what they were leaving behind. The household servants looked worried too. They were trading comfort for the unknown, guided by nothing but their master's faith in a voice. The road south was brutal. Dust coated every face. The horizon shimmered with heat, and yet something in Abram shifted. For the first time, he wasn't merely moving, he was obeying. He had left Haran's wealth behind, but he carried something more valuable: conviction. Still, let's be real, conviction doesn't pay for grain. At the first oasis, a group of travelling traders mocked him. "You left your fortune for sand?" one sneered. Abram smiled faintly. "For promise," he replied. The merchant laughed. "Promise doesn't fill a camel's belly." Abram simply said, "It fills a man's heart," and walked on. Sarai rolled her eyes. Faith might fill hearts, but she still had to ration water. Historians note that Haran's economy thrived because of its strategic location near major caravan routes. Leaving it meant leaving not just wealth, but influence. Yet Abram's migration turned into a model of faith-driven entrepreneurship. In a sense, he was the first to build a startup powered by belief. He wasn't chasing resources, he was chasing revelation. Every night under that endless sky, he'd pitch his tent and build a small altar. Nothing fancy, just stones stacked with reverence. He didn't know if God was watching, but he wanted to keep the line open. Sometimes Sarai would watch from the tent flap, her hands folded, whispering, "May this madness lead somewhere." She wasn't faithless, just pragmatic. If faith was the investment, she wanted returns. Weeks turned into months. The caravan reached the borders of Canaan. It wasn't a land flowing with milk and honey yet. It looked more like drought and disappointment. The hills were barren, the soil rocky. Lot muttered, This is the land we left everything for." Abram didn't answer. He stared at the horizon as though seeing something invisible. The promise wasn't in the dirt, it was in the decree. Theologians still debate whether Abram's early wealth in Canaan was divine favour, or simply the result of shrewd desert management. Either way, the man knew how to thrive in scarcity. He began digging wells, trading livestock, and building quiet. Relationships with local tribes. In a land where no one trusted strangers, his calm dignity became currency. One night, as the wind whispered through the oaks of Moreh, Abram dreamt of an endless expanse of stars. He heard again that voice saying, "To your descendants, I will give this land." He woke up trembling, not in fear but awe. The math didn't add up. He was old, Sarai was barren, and descendants weren't exactly in the forecast. But faith, like compound interest, multiplies invisibly. Lot, younger and hungrier for quick results, grew restless. He wanted cities, not tents. Abram wanted covenant, not convenience. They didn't argue, yet. But even then, the first cracks of ambition had begun to show. Still, Abram prospered. His herds grew, his servants increased. He didn't build walls, he built altars. Each altar was both an offering and a receipt, a way of saying, "God, I'm still holding you to your word." He had traded security for faith, but somehow faith was producing profit. And let's not overlook Sarai's quiet role. Behind the tents, she managed resources with an efficiency modern CFOs would envy. The servants trusted her. The camp ran smoothly. Without her, Abram's dream would have been a logistical disaster. A quirky fact: in some Mesopotamian cultures, travelling families buried small clay tablets inscribed with their family gods near new campsites, believing it secured blessing. Abram broke that tradition. He didn't bring idols, he brought faith. That act alone was as radical as inventing a new financial system. Financial reflection. What this means for your own wealth journey. Leaving Haran reminds us that comfort zones often disguise themselves as blessings. Sometimes the hardest part of wealth creation isn't earning, it's detaching from the familiar. True financial faith means trusting divine guidance more than predictable outcomes. Abram's story shows that vision is worth more than location. It's the courage to walk into uncertainty that births fortune. By the time Abram crossed deeper into Canaan, the land itself seemed to test him. The soil was dry and cracked, and the air shimmered with heat that distorted even the horizon. His camel's steps stirred dust devils that rose and danced like restless spirits. The promise of milk and honey felt more like a cruel joke from heaven. Sarai shielded her eyes and muttered, "You sure this is the place?" Abram, squinting at the barren hills, answered softly, "It doesn't look like it, but he said it would be." That's the paradox of divine promise. It often arrives looking like failure. The famine hit hard, not just a light scarcity, but a full-blown economic collapse. Crops withered, markets dried up, people were selling livestock for crumbs. Even the wells tasted of despair. Abram, the man of faith, found himself calculating rations, bargaining for grain, and wondering if the voice that called him had forgotten to include fine print about famines. Historians still argue whether this famine was localized or part of a larger climate pattern that affected the entire Levant. What matters is that Abram's wealth, his flocks, servants, and silver, was now a liability. Wealth without resources is just weight. The more he owned, the more mouths he had to feed. One evening, while the camp huddled near the dying embers of a fire, Sarai whispered, "Maybe we should go to Egypt. They say the Nile still flows." Abram hesitated. Egypt meant survival, yes, but it also meant leaving the land of promise. Faith and famine, two forces pulling in opposite directions. But hunger isn't poetic, it's persuasive. So they packed up again. The tents came down, the flocks were driven south, the journey to Egypt was long and fraught with danger, bandits, heat, and the quiet shame of retreat. Lot looked relieved. He'd always been fond of cities anyway. Abram just looked older. Egypt, though, was a revelation. Prosperous, organised, a land where order replaced chaos. They had irrigation systems that could turn deserts green, and grain storage that rivaled banks. The people of the Nile were practical, not mystical. They didn't follow unseen voices, they followed the flood. For a moment, Abram felt small, like a desert wanderer crashing a royal gala. Worse, he feared the Egyptians would see his beautiful wife Sarai and kill him to have her. It's one of those awkward moments you wish the Bible had left out. But it didn't. Abram told Sarai to say she was his sister. The plan worked too well. Pharaoh himself took her into his palace, showering Abram with sheep, cattle, servants and silver in gratitude for this supposed sister. Talk about profit margins with moral complications. Theologians still debate whether Abram's deception was cowardice or strategy. Some argue he was protecting God's promise by preserving his life. Others say it was a faith failure. Either way, the outcome was ironic. Abram lied and still got richer, but his conscience suffered for it. Inside the palace, Sarai endured gilded captivity. She was treated like royalty, but every night she prayed for release. And then, as the old story goes, plague struck Pharaoh's household. The text doesn't say how, but the timing was divine accounting. Pharaoh put two and two together, summoned Abram, and said, "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife?" Abram had no answer. Wealth had come, but not peace. Pharaoh expelled them, but not empty-handed. The irony deepened. Egypt's rebuke became Abram's enrichment. They left Egypt with more than they brought. More gold, more livestock, more people. It's as though heaven had whispered, "Even your mistakes won't derail my plan." Abram walked away humbled. Sarai walked away silent. Lot, ever pragmatic, walked away richer and smug. A mainstream historical fact here. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, foreign nomads often migrated temporarily during famines, some returning home with Egyptian goods and techniques. Abram's journey mirrors this pattern. Faith layered over economics. A quirky tidbit. Ancient Egyptian silver jewellery often doubled as currency, worn to keep wealth mobile during crises. Abram likely learned that. Perhaps that's why his household wealth stayed fluid. Gold wasn't just for display, it was liquidity. As they journeyed back toward Canaan, Abram realized something profound. Every blessing came with correction, every increase came with a lesson. Sometimes God lets you stumble into gain to remind you that integrity must still guide abundance. When they reached Bethel, Abram built another altar. No trade, no showmanship, just repentance. He prayed under the same stars that once called him, and for the first time, faith didn't feel like ambition. It felt like surrender. The famine teaches that markets fluctuate, but divine purpose doesn't. Prosperity isn't proof of perfection, and loss isn't proof of failure. Abram's time in Egypt reminds us that wealth gained without integrity carries hidden costs. But even in our detours, grace can turn mistakes into tuition for wisdom. Sometimes your worst deal becomes your richest lesson. The desert air between Egypt and Canaan was thick with irony. Abram had left the promised land because of famine, lied in Egypt to survive, and somehow returned with more wealth than before. The camels jingled with silver trinkets. The servants led sheep in endless trails, and Lot couldn't stop counting. Each evening he tallied their livestock aloud like a man updating his net worth app. Sarai, however, rode in silence. She had seen Pharaoh's palace, its golden walls and perfumed courtyards. Compared to that, a tent and sand felt small. Her faith was bruised, though not broken. Abram knew it too. Every night when they stopped to rest, he'd look toward her tent and whisper a prayer, that the God who had called him out of Ur would heal what fear had fractured. They reached Bethel again, that familiar hill between Bethel and Ai where Abram had once built an altar. The stones were still there, dusted with time. Abram rebuilt it layer upon layer as if reassembling his trust in God. This time he didn't ask for more. He simply gave thanks for what he still had. The camp had grown so large that it looked like a small city. Flocks grazing across valleys, herders shouting, servants tending fires. But abundance brings its own challenges. Soon, tension began to simmer between Abram's herders and Lot's. Water was scarce, grazing land scarcer. Shouting matches became shoving matches. One afternoon, Abram stood atop a hill overlooking the valley and sighed. "Lot," he said, "we're family. Let's not fight. The land is before us. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left." Lot's eyes sparkled. He gazed toward the lush plains of the Jordan near Sodom, a paradise compared to the rocky hills Abram stood on. The choice was easy. Lot chose comfort. Abram chose covenant. Theologians still debate the symbolism of that decision. Some say Lot's choice represents short-term thinking, grabbing visible wealth without seeking divine counsel. Others see Abram's restraint as the maturity of a man who no longer measured success by green pastures but by green lights from heaven. Lot departed with his caravan, waving cheerfully, oblivious to the shadowed fate awaiting his new neighbourhood. Abram watched him go, a mix of sadness and relief in his chest. Sometimes peace costs separation. That night, under a blanket of stars, Abram heard the voice again. "Lift up your eyes, all the land you see, I give to you and your descendants forever." It was as if heaven waited for Lot's departure to renew the contract. The promise hadn't shrunk, it had expanded. Abram's tent sat on dry, rocky ground, yet heaven called it inheritance. Faith, once again, was seeing value where others saw wasteland. Historians note that Abram's wanderings aligned with ancient trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to Egypt, suggesting that his movement wasn't random, it was strategic. He was both pilgrim and entrepreneur. Each altar he built was both a worship site and a claim of intent, like planting a flag of faith across Canaan's soil. Meanwhile, Sarai's influence deepened. She managed the camp's growing complexity with precision. She ensured that each servant was fed, each account balanced. Behind her, Grace was a steel will. If Abram was the visionary, Sarai was the administrator. A quirky historical tidbit: ancient nomadic households often had female administrators overseeing economic affairs while men negotiated with other clans. Sarai fit that archetype perfectly, part matriarch, part CFO of a mobile fortune. Then one evening, as Abram stood gazing toward the horizon, smoke rose in the distance, cities feasting, music echoing faintly on the wind. Sodom, the place Lot had chosen. It looked alive, decadent, invincible. Abram wondered if his nephew's laughter could still reach heaven. The night air cooled. Crickets sang. Abram knelt again by his altar, the firelight dancing on his weathered face. He whispered, "If you bless me, let it not blind me." Lot's decision warns us that not every fertile valley leads to abundance. True prosperity isn't measured by visible lushness, but by divine alignment. Sometimes walking away from the greener field is the smartest financial move of all. Abram teaches us that delayed gain is safer than hasty wealth, because peace of mind is the highest yield. The dawn after Lot's departure arrived like quiet vindication. Abram woke early, stepped out of his tent, and for the first time in months the camp was at peace. No shouting over wells, no herders brawling over grass, just wind, the gentle bleating of sheep, and the distant hum of desert insects. Sarai brewed spiced milk over a small fire, the aroma curling into the air. It wasn't luxury, but it was serenity. Peace, however, has its price tag. Without Lot's herds grazing nearby, the landscape looked emptier. Fewer animals meant fewer trades, fewer profits. Abram's wealth was still vast, but the rhythm of the camp slowed. Even the servants whispered that perhaps Lot had made the smarter move. After all, Sodom's plains shimmered like emerald under the sun, while Abram's hills were cracked and brown. But wealth built on faith, not geography, has roots even drought can't touch. One evening, Abram stood outside, looking toward the horizon where Lot had gone. Distant lightning flashed faintly above Sodom, perhaps a warning, perhaps just weather. Sarai joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Do you miss him?" she asked softly. Abram nodded. "I do, but not his ambition," Sarai smiled. "Ambition runs in your family," he laughed. "True, but some kinds of ambition build altars, others build towers." It was a quiet admission. Abram had learned to stop forcing outcomes. The land might not look promising yet, but heaven had already signed the deed. Weeks passed. The caravan thrived modestly. Trade with local tribes increased. Abram's reputation as a fair negotiator spread. He wasn't a conqueror, he was a stabilizer. Chiefs began to treat him not as a foreigner, but as a trusted ally. It's a pattern repeated through history. When one man walks by principle, even pagans respect the predictability of his integrity. Then came trouble. Lot's paradise turned into a battlefield. 5 kings rebelled against 4, and Sodom, Lot's city of choice, was caught in the crossfire. News travelled fast along the trade routes. Armies marched, cities burned, wealth was looted. Among the captives, Lot. When a survivor stumbled into Abram's camp, dusty and half dead, the news hit like a spear. Sarai gasped. Abram clenched his jaw. This wasn't just family, it was destiny calling again. Faith might wait, but it doesn't ignore injustice. And so, the patriarch who preferred altars over armour became a general overnight. He rallied 318 trained servants, men born in his household, loyal, disciplined, perhaps the first private security force recorded in scripture. They armed themselves with spears and courage, moving like shadows through the night. Historians still debate whether this battle was small-scale tribal warfare or part of a broader Mesopotamian campaign. Either way, Abram's strategy was brilliant. He attacked by night, dividing his forces, surprising the enemy near Damascus. Lot was rescued. The kings, loot reclaimed. Abram, the peaceful herdsman, became the desert's unexpected war hero. When he returned, the rescued captives cheered, and the valley glowed with fires of celebration. Lot, shaken but alive, embraced him awkwardly. "Uncle, I didn't deserve this," he whispered. Abram replied, "Grace rarely comes to those who deserve it. It comes to those who need it." But the victory scene turned stranger still. The king of Sodom, all flamboyant robes and perfume, came to meet Abram, demanding, "Give me the people, keep the goods." Then from nowhere appeared another figure, Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king of Salem. He brought bread and wine and blessed Abram in the name of the Most High God. No one quite knew where he came from or where he went afterward. Theologians still argue over who Melchizedek really was, a theophany of Christ, a Canaanite priest of Yahweh, or an ancient order lost to time. Whatever the truth, the encounter shimmered with mystery. Melchizedek blessed Abram, and Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. Centuries before, tithing became religious law. It was spontaneous gratitude, not obligation. Then, in a move that would baffle most modern financiers, Abram refused the spoils of war. "I will take nothing belonging to you," he told the king of Sodom, "so you can never say, 'I made Abram rich.'" He preferred divine dividends to political partnerships. Lot returned to Sodom. Yes, back to the very city that had nearly destroyed him. Abram let him go, his eyes full of sorrow, Some lessons can't be taught, only lived twice, a mainstream historical fact. Canaan during this period was a patchwork of city-states constantly at war, and coalitions like the one Abram defeated did exist. His victory, therefore, wasn't just spiritual, it was geopolitical. A quirky tidbit: ancient Mesopotamian generals often poured oil on their swords before battle, believing it carried divine favour. Abram poured faith instead, and somehow that worked better. That night, under the desert sky, Abram sat by his fire. The stars shimmered, and his men sang songs of triumph. But he felt something heavier than gold, a sense of divine accountability. Victory without greed, prosperity without pride. He whispered, "Lord, let my fortune always follow my faith, not the other way around." Abram's refusal to profit from Sodom's spoils teaches us that integrity is a greater hedge than profit. True wealth doesn't come from clever alliances, but from clean hands. Your reputation is your most valuable asset. Guard it more fiercely than your bank account. When you can walk away from money that compromises you, you've already mastered abundance. The campfire had burned low when the silence around Abram deepened into something sacred. The stars above seemed closer that night, like they had drawn near to listen. The victory was behind him now, and the spoils he refused lay forgotten in the dust. But in his chest a quiet doubt stirred. He had riches, land, servants, and favour among kings, yet still no heir. What's a fortune without someone to inherit it? Sarai had long stopped talking about children. Her laughter when neighbours asked about it had grown thin, almost brittle. Abram tried not to look at the ache in her eyes, but alone at night, when the desert winds moaned like ghosts, he whispered the question he was too afraid to voice in daylight. "What will you give me, seeing I go childless?" Then came the voice again, this time not booming from the heavens, but felt deep within, like thunder wrapped in tenderness. "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your very great reward. Faith is easy when your herds multiply. It's harder when your legacy doesn't." That night, Abram stepped out of his tent. The desert stretched endlessly before him, the stars like scattered diamonds. The air was cold enough to bite, and God said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars if you can, so shall your descendants be." For a moment, Abram's doubt fell silent. The night became a cathedral, the stars his only witnesses. He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He just believed. And the heavens recorded it as righteousness. Historians and theologians still debate whether this covenant moment happened through vision, dream, or direct encounter. What's certain is its revolutionary tone. No temple, no ritual, just a personal promise sealed with trust. It redefined the ancient understanding of wealth, not as property, but as legacy. Then came a ritual unlike any other. Abram was told to prepare a sacrifice: a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a pigeon. He cut the animals in two, arranging the halves opposite each other. A strange, almost grim ceremony. In ancient Mesopotamia, such acts were how covenants were sealed. Both parties would walk between the pieces, symbolizing, "May this happen to me if I break my word." But as dusk settled, Abram fell into a deep, terrifying sleep. Darkness descended, not just physical, but spiritual. He felt a dreadful heaviness, like the future itself pressing on him. Then, in the vision, a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch passed between the pieces. God himself had walked the path of covenant alone. Abram wasn't asked to promise anything. The deal was divine, one-sided grace. When Abram awoke, the night was still. Smoke from the altar curled upward, fragrant and ghostly. He sat in awe, realizing something profound. God had bound himself by promise. Heaven had entered a contract with dust. Sarai, curious but cautious, asked what had happened. Abram tried to explain, but words failed. How do you describe the indescribable? He just said, "He walked between the pieces." Sarai frowned. "Who?" Abram smiled faintly. "The one who called us." A mainstream historical fact. In ancient Near Eastern treaties, only equals walked between the pieces together. For a deity to do so alone was unheard of. It flipped the hierarchy upside down. It meant the divine was guaranteeing blessing regardless of human performance. That was radical grace millennia before the term existed. A quirky tidbit: Babylonian astrologers believed the stars were the literal writing of the gods, signatures across the sky. Abram's night vision, then, was heaven's way of re-signing its promise in visible ink. The next morning, Abram rose changed. He wasn't younger, richer, or stronger, but something in him had solidified. The journey was no longer about finding land or gold. It was about trusting that unseen covenant. He walked differently, prayed differently, even managed differently. His faith had matured from transaction to trust. But deep inside, one fear lingered like an unhealed scar: Sarai's empty arms. Faith could count stars, but it couldn't rock a cradle. At least not yet. True wealth isn't measured in what you hold, but in what you believe. Abram's covenant moment teaches that lasting prosperity begins with alignment, not accumulation. When your vision of wealth joins divine purpose, even unseen promises become assets. Every act of faith is an investment in the future, and God's interest rate never defaults. Sarai sat in the shade of her tent, the air hot and heavy with frustration. Years had passed since that night under the stars, and still, no child. She had prayed until her lips went dry. Her faith had turned from hopeful to hollow. Every sunrise mocked her with silence. Abram was now old enough to be a grandfather to other people's children, and she, well, her body had long crossed the line between waiting and impossibility. That morning, as the camp stirred to life, Sarai called Abram into the tent. Her voice was calm, almost businesslike. "The Lord has kept me from bearing children," she said. "Go into my maidservant, Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram's eyes widened. The words hit like a stone. Hagar, the young Egyptian servant they had acquired in Pharaoh's court, was quiet, capable, and loyal. The plan made practical sense, culturally speaking. In those days, a barren wife could use her servant as a surrogate, and the child would legally be hers. It was socially acceptable, but spiritually desperate. Abram hesitated. Then he nodded slowly. "If this is what you wish." And with that, faith took a shortcut. Theologians still argue whether Abram's decision was lack of faith or misguided love. Perhaps it was both. Sometimes the pressure to help God feels more righteous than waiting. But shortcuts always leave scars. Months passed, and Hagar conceived. What should have brought joy instead ignited jealousy. Sarai's bitterness festered. She watched Hagar's belly grow round while hers stayed flat. The household air turned thick with tension. Hagar began to flaunt subtle superiority. After all, she carried Abram's heir. Sarai snapped, "May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram, weary of the conflict, shrugged helplessly. "She's your servant. Do with her as you please." And so, Sarai drove Hagar into the wilderness. It's one of the Bible's quiet tragedies. A woman wounded by barrenness wounding another woman out of pain. Hagar fled, pregnant and alone, until an angel found her by a desert spring. "Return to your mistress," the angel said, "and submit." Then came a prophecy. Her son would be named Ishmael, God hears. The promise of hearing, not yet healing. Historians note that this story reflects the social structure of the ancient Near East, where concubinage was common in dynastic households seeking heirs. But rarely was it accompanied by divine intervention. That's what makes this episode unique. It reveals that heaven listens even to the outcast. A quirky historical tidbit: Egyptian servants like Hagar were often given as dowries during trade alliances. Her presence in Abram's camp symbolized Egypt's lingering influence, proof that past compromises can echo through future generations. When Hagar returned, tensions still simmered, but Ishmael's birth softened the household, at least for a while. Abram loved the boy deeply. He taught him to tend flocks, to navigate dunes, to pray beneath the stars. Yet every time he looked into Ishmael's eyes, a flicker of guilt passed behind his smile. Faith had produced fruit, but not fulfillment. Years rolled on like the endless desert. Abram's beard greyed, his back bent slightly, and his tent filled with laughter again, mostly Ishmael's. Still, when night came, he'd step outside, stare at the heavens, and whisper, "You said stars. How many have I so far?" Then, one evening, the voice returned. Calm, steady, unrelenting. "Walk before me and be blameless. Abram fell face down. "My covenant is with you," God said, "and you will be the father of many nations." The air trembled with divine finality. Then came something new, a change of name. No longer Abram, the exalted father. Now Abraham, the father of many. Sarai too would be renamed Sarah, princess. The covenant deepened. God promised nations, kings, descendants beyond number. But he also demanded a sign, circumcision, a physical mark of belonging. It was as if heaven said, "This time, no shortcuts. This mark is permanent." Abraham obeyed without question. At 99, he carried the pain like a badge of obedience. The next morning, limping but smiling, he knew the difference between believing in a promise and living for it. Sarah laughed when she heard God say she'd bear a son. Not a mocking laugh, more like disbelief dressed as humour. "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" she said. Heaven heard her laughter and answered with its own gentle irony. "Your son will be called Isaac." The name itself meant laughter. God had turned skepticism into prophecy. Theologians still argue whether that laughter was sin or surrender. Maybe it was both. But God wasn't offended. Sometimes faith wobbles before it walks. When faith delays, don't build your own version of the promise. Hagar's story reminds us that impatience can generate short-term gains that cost long-term peace. True wealth, spiritual or financial, grows through disciplined trust, not forced outcomes. Even when the timeline feels absurd, divine timing remains the best investment horizon. The air that morning carried a rare calm, the kind that comes before revelation or ruin. Abraham sat near the entrance of his tent, the desert sun just cresting over the hills. The sand glowed gold, and the wind moved softly, like breath over parchment. Sarah was inside, humming absent-mindedly as she kneaded bread. For once, peace hung in the camp like a fragile curtain. Then, without warning, 3 strangers appeared on the horizon. Not approaching with haste or sound, just there, as though the light itself had shaped them. Abraham squinted, rubbed his eyes, and felt that unmistakable weight in his chest, the awareness that this was no ordinary visit. He rose, hurried to meet them, and bowed low to the ground. "My lord," he said, "if I have found favour in your eyes, do not pass your servant by. Let me bring water to wash your feet and rest under this tree. I'll bring food and you can refresh yourselves before you continue." Hospitality was no small thing in the desert. It was survival. Refusing rest or food could mean death, and Abraham, now a man of great wealth and reputation, chose to serve like a host, not a lord. He rushed to Sarah. "Quick, 3 measures of the finest flour. Knead it and bake bread." He then ran to his herd, selected a tender calf and told a servant to prepare it. Butter, milk, roasted meat, fresh cakes. It was a royal feast served under a humble tent. Historians confirm that desert hospitality in nomadic cultures was both custom and currency. Honour wasn't stored in vaults, but in how generously one treated strangers. Abraham's wealth didn't just sit in herds, it moved through his hands into service. As the guests ate, one of them looked up and asked, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" Abraham gestured toward the tent. "There, inside." Then the stranger said something that froze the air. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, Sarah stopped kneading dough. She covered her mouth and laughed, a soft, unbelieving chuckle. "After I am worn out and my husband is old, shall I now have pleasure?" she whispered. It was the laugh of a woman who had waited too long to hope. Outside, the stranger turned his head and asked, "Why did Sarah laugh?" Sarah's heart dropped. She hadn't realized she'd been overheard. "I didn't laugh," she lied, voice trembling. The stranger smiled. "Yes, you did." It wasn't rebuke, it was revelation. Abraham said nothing. His eyes burned with tears he didn't expect. The visitors rose, and as they looked toward the plains of Sodom, their tone shifted from warmth to gravity. One of them said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" And then the truth unfolded. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had become so corrupt that their cries had reached heaven. Judgment was coming. Abraham's chest tightened. Lot lived there. The promise of laughter was about to share air with the smoke of destruction. When the men turned to leave, Abraham walked with them, daring to negotiate with the divine. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. It was the first recorded bargaining prayer, a man haggling with heaven for mercy. From 50 righteous souls to 45, then 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. God agreed. For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. The theologians still debate why Abraham stopped at 10. Perhaps hope ran out before faith did. Some say he feared pushing too far, others believe he knew even 10 might be a miracle. Either way, he stood between justice and mercy that night, the same way every investor stands between risk and reward. Later, when the strangers departed and only the wind remained, Sarah emerged from the tent, flower on her hands. "Did I really laugh?" she asked softly. Abraham nodded, smiling faintly. "Yes, and one day we'll laugh again." The night grew still. Abraham watched the stars, the same ones that had witnessed every promise before. He didn't yet know what would happen to Sodom, but he knew one truth. When heaven visits your home, generosity is the door that opens it. A quirky historical note. Ancient Jewish tradition held that these 3 visitors represented divine attributes: justice, mercy, and healing. In that light, Abraham wasn't just hosting guests, he was entertaining the structure of heaven itself. Generosity is a magnet for revelation. Abraham's lavish hospitality wasn't waste, it was worship. In every act of giving, you create room for blessing. The world calls it risk, heaven calls it partnership. Never forget, the tent that opens its door to strangers becomes the tent God visits. The next morning, the eastern sky glowed red, like an omen. Abraham stood on the ridge, looking toward the plains below. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, drifting over Sodom like an early warning. The memory of the 3 visitors still clung to him, their words, their calm authority, their promise, and their warning. He didn't yet know that this day would mark both the darkest and the brightest turn in his journey of faith. Down in the valley, Sodom's walls shimmered in the sun, alive with trade and noise. Up here, Abraham's camp was still. No music, no markets, only the quiet of those who had learned to wait on unseen winds. Sarah moved slowly now. Her body, old yet strangely alive with new energy, carried the spark of something impossible. Within her, promise had taken form. Weeks earlier, the laughter had seemed absurd. Now it stirred beneath her ribs. Sarah tried not to think about the pain or the fear. She had seen too much to expect miracles. Yet every time she caught Abraham watching her with that tender, boyish awe, she found herself smiling. The promise, once a distant metaphor, was now heartbeat and breath. But heaven's patience with Sodom had ended. 2 of the 3 visitors, angels though Abraham didn't know it then, entered the city. Lot greeted them and begged them to stay the night. The story that unfolded there, fire, flight, and the fall of cities, is one the world still whispers about. When the smoke finally rose, visible even from miles away, Abraham stood again on that ridge, silent. He watched as the once lush valley turned black, as if the earth itself were erasing a mistake. The wind carried the stench of sulphur and burnt stone. He didn't speak, but inside him a truth settled like dust. Mercy has a cost, and every choice carries its dividend. Historians suggest that the destruction of Sodom may have been inspired by a real event, perhaps an asteroid or earthquake near the Dead Sea region that caused fire and brimstone to rain down. Whatever the mechanism, the message survived longer than the cities. Moral decay eventually bankrupts even the richest economies. A quirky note from early Jewish tradition claims that Lot's wife didn't merely look back out of curiosity, but out of regret. Her heart still tethered to luxury, not legacy. It's a small detail, but it adds chilling realism. Nostalgia for sin can petrify progress. When the wind finally cleared, Abraham turned away. His faith had matured again, not through gain, but grief. He realized that wealth without righteousness destroys, and compassion without boundaries corrodes. Still, he prayed silently for Lot and for the remnant that might remain. That evening, Sarah sat outside, resting her hands on her growing belly. "Do you think God really forgave them?" she asked. Abraham stared into the distance. "Forgiveness doesn't always look like survival," he said softly. "Sometimes it's just the chance to start again, elsewhere." The camp moved northward after that. Abraham was a man who never stayed still for long. His tents were made for travel, not permanence. They pitched camp near Gerar, a Philistine settlement by the Mediterranean coast. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. The locals were friendly but watchful, curious about the wandering patriarch and his pregnant aged wife. Then came a moment Abraham would later regret. Fearing the king of Gerar might covet Sarah, he repeated an old mistake. He told people she was his sister. Old habits die hard even in holy men. King Abimelech, charmed by Sarah's beauty, took her into his household, and once again, divine intervention followed. In a dream, God warned Abimelech, "You're a dead man because of the woman you've taken. She is married." Terrified, the king confronted Abraham the next day. "Why did you do this to me?" he demanded. Abraham's excuse was weak. "I thought there was no fear of God in this place," he said. Abimelech shook his head. "Your fear made me guilty before God. Take your wife and go, but take gifts too. My land is before you." Sarah said little when they left Gerar, but the silence between them was heavy with meaning. Love, faith, and folly make a complicated marriage. Still, their story kept moving forward, pulled by grace stronger than their failures. The theologians still debate why Abraham repeated his old deception. Some say it reveals human inconsistency, that even the faithful falter under pressure. Others see it as proof that divine favour doesn't depend on perfection, only persistence. That night, as they camped near the coast, Sarah sat under the stars, her hands over her stomach. "Do you think he still trusts us?" she asked. Abraham smiled faintly. "I think he never stopped." A shooting star streaked across the sky. The same heavens that had once called him now seemed to wink in reassurance. Promise was still alive, and soon it would cry in his arms. Financial reflection. What this means for your own wealth journey. Wealth tests integrity more than poverty ever could. Abraham's relapse in Gerar shows that fear makes poor financial and moral decisions. Real faith-based prosperity isn't the absence of risk. It's the refusal to compromise truth for safety. When you build your fortune on trust instead of fear, even your failures become proof of grace. It was dawn when Sarah's cry split the stillness of camp. Servants rushed to her tent, shouting for water, linen, and Abraham. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and faith. The impossible was happening. An old woman was giving birth. Outside, Abraham stood trembling, half in terror, half in joy. He had fought kings and crossed deserts, but nothing in his long life had prepared him for this moment. Then came the sound, a baby's wail, sharp and alive. The midwives laughed, the servants cheered, and Sarah, pale but radiant, whispered, "His name will be Isaac." Her voice shook when she said it. Laughter. She had once laughed at God. Now she laughed with him. Abraham held the child in his trembling arms. The wrinkles on his face deepened with emotion. For the first time in decades, the promise wasn't just words in the wind. It had skin, warmth, and breath. He kissed Isaac's forehead and whispered, "So this is what faith looks like when it matures." Word of the miracle spread fast. Traders passing through the region told stories of the desert couple who birthed a son in their 90s. Historians later noted that longevity and fertility myths were common in ancient literature, but none carried this moral inversion, where the miracle confirmed obedience, not ego. Sarah's tent became the heart of joy. Her laughter echoed through the camp, contagious and healing. Even the servants felt it. Hope had returned to the household. Yet in the midst of the celebration, shadows lingered. Ishmael, now a teenager, watched from a distance. His eyes carried confusion, a mixture of pride, pain, and something darker. One afternoon, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac during a feast. Perhaps it was playful, perhaps it wasn't. But to a mother guarding a miracle, it felt like threat. She went to Abraham, her voice sharp with emotion. "Send this slave woman and her son away," she demanded. "The son of this bondwoman shall not share in the inheritance with my Isaac." Abraham froze. It was one of those moments where faith and family collide. Ishmael was his blood, his boy. He loved him. But the voice returned, steady, sorrowful, firm. "Do not be distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to Sarah, for it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. But I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also." Abraham rose early the next morning. The sky was grey, the kind of colourless dawn that mirrors grief. He packed water and bread, placed them on Hagar's shoulder, and kissed Ishmael's forehead one last time. No words, just eyes that said everything. And then they walked into the wilderness. The desert swallowed them quickly. Days later, when the water ran out and the boy collapsed, Hagar wept bitterly. "I cannot watch the boy die," she said, stepping away. But heaven heard the cry of the child. The same voice that once called Abram out of Ur now spoke to a mother on the brink of despair. "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy. Lift him up, for I will make him a great nation." And then she saw it, a well of water gleaming in the sun. Ishmael lived. Grace again had split the sand. A mainstream historical fact. Ancient Near Eastern nomads often trace tribal origins to such desert survival stories. The Ishmaelites, descendants of that child, would later become renowned traders and warriors, descendants of both rejection and promise. A quirky tidbit. Desert wells were often seen as divine gifts. Many were marked with cairns or altars. It's said that Hagar's well was later called Bir Lahai Roi, the well of the living one who sees me. Back in Abraham's camp, Sarah's tent overflowed with celebration, but somewhere deep inside her joy was a quiet melancholy. She had fought too hard to laugh freely. Some nights, she'd hold Isaac close and whisper, "You cost me more than I'll ever tell." Abraham understood. Each step of his wealth, each covenant, each promise had come through sacrifice, geographical, emotional, spiritual. Yet through it all, he had learned this truth. Obedience may drain you, but it always refills you with purpose. When Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. Elders, travellers, servants, all gathered under the bright canopy of stars. Laughter mingled with music. Even Sarah danced, awkward but sincere. The smell of roasted lamb filled the air, mingling with the incense of gratitude. Theologians still discuss this moment as the peak of Abraham's human joy, the season when faith finally bore fruit. But the story was far from over. Every mountaintop of blessing hides the shadow of another test. And for Abraham, the next one would demand not his fortune, but his heart. That night, long after the guests had gone, Abraham stepped outside with Isaac sleeping in his arms. He looked at the stars once more, just as he had on the night of his calling. The same sky, the same promise, but now a child in his hands. He smiled and whispered, "You kept your word, and I'll keep mine." Isaac's birth reminds us that the greatest returns come after the longest silence. Waiting seasons aren't wasted. They refine your faith portfolio. Like Abraham, you must trust that divine timing compounds unseen. The laughter of fulfillment always sounds sweeter after years of obedience. Hold on, the promise is still alive even when the evidence isn't. The morning Abraham heard the next command, the air felt heavier than usual, like the world itself was holding its breath. The laughter of Isaac still echoed faintly from inside the tent, and Sarah's humming floated through the camp. Everything looked perfect. Wealth, peace, family, fulfillment. And that's when God whispered the most unbearable words Abraham had ever heard. "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. Offer him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Time seemed to stop. Abraham didn't shout, didn't argue. He just stood there, staring into the sand as the words replayed in his mind like a nightmare. "Your only son, whom you love." The repetition felt surgical, each phrase cutting deeper. This wasn't a test of obedience, it was a test of identity. Sarah never knew. He couldn't tell her. What could he possibly say? "I'm taking the boy for a walk with firewood." So he rose early, too early, and saddled the donkey himself. Isaac walked beside him, curious and carefree. Two servants followed at a distance. The boy carried the wood, Abraham carried the fire and knife, and heaven carried the silence. For 3 days they travelled. Each sunrise felt like betrayal, each step like another withdrawal from a trust fund of faith he couldn't afford to deplete. The mountains loomed ahead like waiting judges. Historians note that Mount Moriah, later associated with Jerusalem's Temple Mount, symbolises ultimate devotion, the point where heaven and earth negotiate trust. For Abraham, it was more personal. This wasn't theology, it was heartbreak with coordinates. On the third day, Abraham saw the mountain. He stopped the servants. "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and we will come back to you." The phrase hung in the air. We will come back. Was it hope? Faith? Denial? Maybe all three. Isaac looked up at him as they climbed. "Father," he said, "the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb?" Abraham's throat tightened. "God himself will provide the lamb, my son." When they reached the summit, Abraham built an altar with trembling hands. He arranged the wood. Isaac, trusting and unresisting, let himself be bound. The boy's eyes met his father's, calm but questioning. Abraham's heart shattered silently. He lifted the knife. And then, heaven broke the silence. "Abraham! Abraham!" The voice thundered like mercy wrapped in lightning. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Abraham dropped the blade. His body crumpled, trembling, and then he saw it. A ram caught by its horns in a nearby thicket. He fell to his knees, sobbing as he untied Isaac. Together, father and son offered the ram instead. The smoke rose heavenward, carrying both their relief and their renewed devotion. He named that, "Place Jehovah-Jireh, the Lord will provide." The phrase became a cornerstone of faith for generations to come. It meant not just that God gives, but that he foresees every need and meets it at the appointed time. Theologians still debate the nature of the test. Did God truly need proof of Abraham's faith? Or was it Abraham who needed to discover the depth of his own trust? Perhaps the test was never about sacrifice, but surrender, the letting go of even the blessings God himself had given. A quirky historical note. In ancient Canaanite religion, child sacrifice was tragically common among pagan nations. This story turned that horror upside down. It declared that the true God does not demand death to prove devotion. He provides life instead. When they descended the mountain, Isaac walked silently, clutching his father's hand. The boy's innocence was gone, replaced by an awareness beyond his years. Abraham's silence wasn't guilt, it was awe. He had seen what very few mortals ever glimpse, the moment where faith and provision intersect. Back at camp, Sarah ran out to meet them. She embraced Isaac, weeping, unaware of what almost happened. Abraham just whispered, "He provides, Sarah. He always provides." That night, as the stars reappeared in their familiar constellations, Abraham lay awake. He realized that wealth, legacy, land, all of it meant nothing if it owned him. True riches were measured by what he could lay down, not what he could hold on to. Abraham's test on Moriah reminds us that the greatest proof of faith is not what we're willing to acquire, but what we're willing to release. The path to divine provision often begins where human control ends. When you can lay your Isaac on the altar, your dream, your plan, your comfort, you invite the kind of abundance that no market, job, or inheritance can match. The morning after Mount Moriah was eerily peaceful. Birds sang, the camp bustled. Life pretended nothing had changed. But Abraham knew everything had. He walked differently, slower, more deliberate. He had carried faith to its furthest limit and returned with something purer, a trust unshaken by logic. Sarah noticed it immediately. "Something in you has quieted," she said one evening, as they watched the sun dip behind the hills. Abraham smiled faintly. "Yes," he replied. "I stopped negotiating with God." Sarah didn't ask what that meant. Deep down, she sensed it. Isaac played nearby, building a small pile of stones, imitating his father's altars. His laughter filled the air, as bright and innocent as the promise itself. Life resumed its rhythm. The herds multiplied again, servants bustled with renewed purpose, and the name Jehovah-Jireh spread through nearby tribes. Abraham's reputation as the man whose God provides grew beyond borders. Traders would stop at his camp asking not for business but for blessing. One evening, as stars shimmered overhead, a messenger from Abimelech, the Philistine king Abraham once deceived, arrived. He came not to accuse but to propose peace. "God is with you in everything you do," Abimelech said. "Swear to me that you will not deal falsely with me or my descendants." Abraham agreed. The two men sealed their treaty with 7 ewe lambs beside a well. Abraham named it Beersheba, the well of the oath. The spring still flowed as a symbol that peace and prosperity can coexist when trust replaces fear. Historians believe that Beersheba was a strategic location controlling trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Owning wells there meant controlling commerce. In essence, Abraham had just secured both spiritual and financial stability through diplomacy, a rare blend of faith and foresight. A quirky historical tidbit. In ancient desert lore, a treaty sealed beside a well wasn't just political, it was sacred. Wells symbolized life itself. To share one was to pledge mutual survival. Abraham's well became a kind of ancient stock exchange, faith-backed liquidity. Isaac grew stronger. His curiosity was endless. He followed Abraham everywhere, asking questions about stars, sheep, and the invisible God who talked in whispers. Abraham's answers were always patient, but never simple. "One day," he'd tell Isaac, "you'll understand that every promise worth having must be carried, not chased." Sarah, though aging, remained fiercely protective. She rarely let Isaac out of her sight. The memory of losing Ishmael haunted her more than she admitted. Yet each night she'd watch her son sleep and whisper, "You are the laughter that God turned into legacy." But years rolled on, and time, unforgiving and silent, tightened its grip. Sarah's strength waned. Her hair turned silver, her hands frail. She had lived through famine, faith, exile, and miracle. One morning, she simply didn't wake up. When Abraham found her, he didn't wail. He sat beside her body in stunned stillness. The woman who had laughed at angels and managed empires was gone. The camp fell silent for days. Servants mourned quietly, and Isaac wept openly. Abraham, however, seemed carved from stone. His grief was private, sacred, the kind that reshapes a man's soul instead of breaking it. He decided she would not be buried in borrowed land. He went to the sons of Heth and requested to buy the cave of Machpelah as a burial site. "I am a foreigner among you," he said, "but sell me property for a burial place." The negotiation was long but respectful. The Hittite leader Ephron offered the land as a gift, but Abraham insisted on paying full price, 400 shekels of silver. He wouldn't owe anyone gratitude for something sacred. Ownership was stewardship, not sentiment. So, the field of Machpelah became his first true property in the Promised Land. Not a battlefield conquest, but a purchase born of honour. The cave became Sarah's resting place, and later his own. Theologians still reflect on this moment as the culmination of Abraham's earthly wisdom. The man who once walked away from civilization now navigated commerce with divine dignity. He had learned that faith doesn't despise transaction, it sanctifies it. A mainstream historical fact: the Hittites were known for their advanced property laws and detailed legal contracts. Abraham's recorded purchase aligns perfectly with Hittite legal practices, offering one of the earliest examples of a private real estate acquisition in biblical history. That night after the burial, Abraham sat alone near the cave. The wind rustled the grass and the moonlight fell gently across the stones. He whispered, "You were right to laugh, Sarah. God always finishes what he starts." Abraham's purchase of the cave reminds us that real wealth is stewardship, not possession. Paying full price for sacred ground teaches integrity in transactions. Never take what's free if it costs your honour. The richest people aren't those who inherit land, but those who secure it with character. Faith may start with promise, but it matures through responsibility. The cave at Machpelah became a quiet sanctuary, a reminder that even promises need resting places. Abraham would often visit it at dusk, sitting outside the entrance, while the wind sighed softly through the oaks of Mamre. He spoke to God there more than anywhere else. Not prayers of desperation this time, but of gratitude, and sometimes confession. He had learned that every fulfilled promise leaves behind echoes of failure, moments when faith almost cracked. But now, another concern pressed on his mind: Isaac's future. The boy was no longer a child. He was strong, thoughtful, and reserved. The son of laughter had grown into a man of quiet reverence. Yet there was something missing: a wife. Abraham, ever practical, summoned his chief servant Eliezer of Damascus, the same faithful steward who had managed his household through famine and war. "You will not take a wife for my son from among the Canaanites," Abraham instructed. "Go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for Isaac there." Eliezer hesitated. "And if the woman will not come with me?" Abraham smiled gently. "The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house, will send his angel before you." Faith, at this stage, had become muscle memory. Abraham no longer needed signs. He had seen too much of God's mathematics, how divine timing multiplies obedience into outcomes. Eliezer departed with 10 camels laden with gifts, jewellery, fine linens, and gold. It was an ancient form of venture capital, symbolic of covenantal investment. After many days, he arrived at the city of Nahor near a well. It was evening, the time when women came to draw water. He prayed softly, "Lord God of my master Abraham, grant me success today. Let the girl who offers water to me and my camels be the one you've chosen." Moments later, a young woman approached, Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. She was graceful, confident, and kind. When Eliezer asked for a drink, she not only gave him water, but also ran to draw water for all his camels, a laborious act that revealed both humility and strength. Historians note that watering 10 camels could require up to 200 gallons, a massive undertaking. This wasn't coincidence, it was character manifesting through action. As Eliezer watched, stunned by the speed of answered prayer, he bowed low and worshipped. "Blessed be the Lord who has not forsaken his mercy and truth toward my master." Rebekah invited him to her family's home, where Eliezer told his story in detail. The family listened, astonished. Her father and brother said, "This thing has come from the Lord." The next morning, Rebekah agreed to go. No hesitation, no drama, just faith in motion. A quirky historical tidbit. In many ancient cultures, wells symbolized divine encounter. From Mesopotamia to Arabia, marriages at the well often represented covenant beginnings. Rebekah's story fit perfectly into that sacred pattern, the union of purpose and providence. Back in Canaan, Isaac was meditating in a field at dusk when he looked up and saw the caravan approaching. The camels kicked up clouds of gold dust in the fading light. Rebekah, seeing him, asked, "Who is that man walking toward us?" Eliezer smiled. "That is my master's son." Rebekah veiled herself, the symbol of modesty and new beginnings. When Isaac met her, no words were recorded, only this. He brought her into his mother Sarah's tent and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Abraham, old but watchful, saw it all with quiet satisfaction. The promise had reproduced itself, not just biologically but spiritually. The line of faith had another branch, and the covenant another generation to carry it forward. That night, as the camp celebrated, Abraham stepped away to the ridge overlooking his flocks. The moon hung low and full, the same moon that had once witnessed his first uncertain steps out of Ur. He closed his eyes and whispered, "You kept every word." Theologians often interpret this as Abraham's final great act of stewardship, not war, not wealth, but arranging the next chapter. Faith doesn't hoard blessings, it transfers them wisely. Abraham's management of Isaac's marriage reveals a principle every wise builder learns. Legacy is the final investment. True wealth isn't measured by accumulation but continuation. What outlives you? Like Abraham, you must pair faith with foresight, set systems in motion, mentor successors, and create the kind of stability that lets others inherit not just your fortune but your values. Abraham's hair had turned silver long ago, but now even his voice had grown thin with age. His movements were slower, his sentences shorter, but his gaze, his gaze, still carried that old spark of fire, that quiet confidence that he was not walking toward death but merely continuing the journey that had begun under the stars of Ur. Isaac and Rebekah's laughter now filled the camp, blending with the sounds of livestock and children. Even the servants said the household felt lighter again, as if Sarah's laughter had been reborn through her son's wife. But Abraham's days were now measured not in herds or gold but in memories. He had seen too much, lost too much, believed too much to be troubled by the noise of mortality. Still, he wasn't finished. There was one more matter of order left to settle. He had remarried. The scriptures mention her briefly. Keturah, a woman whose name meant fragrance. She was gentle, patient, and practical. A quiet companion for a man whose soul had seen heaven's fire and lived to tell the tale. From her, Abraham would have more sons, Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Each name would echo across deserts and kingdoms long after he was gone. But even in fatherhood, he practiced stewardship. He gave gifts to the sons of Keturah while he was still alive, sending them eastward with cattle, silver and gold. He made it clear Isaac was the heir of promise, the line of covenant. The others would have inheritance, but not destiny. Historians note that this act of planned inheritance reflected sophisticated estate management practices among patriarchal clans. Abraham's clarity ensured unity after his death. In an age when dynasties fell apart through rivalry, his foresight preserved harmony. A quirky historical tidbit. Some Arabian tribes later traced their lineage to Keturah's sons, particularly Midian. Centuries later, Moses would marry a Midianite woman, proof that even Abraham's secondary branches bore divine fruit. Legacy, it seems, knows no wasted seeds. As the years waned, Abraham spent more time under the shade of the oaks at Mamre, gazing at the horizon. His conversations with God became less about requests and more about reflection. "You took me from my father's house," he'd whisper, "and you gave me more than land. You gave me laughter, legacy, and peace." Sometimes Isaac would sit beside him, quietly listening. Once, Isaac asked, "Father, was it worth it? Leaving everything?" Abraham smiled, his eyes glinting like fading stars. All obedience feels costly until the harvest comes. Then you realize obedience is the harvest. At twilight, Abraham would watch Rebekah draw water from the well, her movements graceful, efficient. She reminded him of Sarah's strength, tempered with serenity. He saw in her the continuation of everything he and Sarah had fought, wept, and believed for. The promise wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. But there were also quiet days of solitude. He often walked to Machpelah to sit beside Sarah's tomb. The grass had grown over the entrance, soft and green. "You were right to laugh," he would murmur, "but you should have stayed long enough to see the laughter multiply." He always left a handful of flowers, simple desert blooms, nothing extravagant. The theologians often say that Abraham's last years were his richest, not in gold or land, but in wisdom. He no longer chased blessings. They followed him like shadows. His camp became a school of faith. Travellers would stop to ask for counsel, and he would smile and say, "Faith is just accounting, believing that what God owes, he always pays in full." He taught Isaac how to balance generosity with prudence. "Never build altars you won't maintain," he told him, "and never make promises you won't pay. The world watches how the blessed behave with what they're given." At night, when the campfire flickered and the stars emerged one by one, Abraham would close his eyes and remember the first voice that called him. It still sounded clear. "Go." And he had gone. Every blessing, every trial, every miracle had flowed from that single act of obedience. He smiled at the thought. "I never owned a thing," he whispered once to Keturah. "I just managed what belonged to him." Abraham's final years reveal that legacy wealth isn't about empire. It's about structure, stewardship, and spirit. He didn't just leave inheritance. He distributed wisely, documented clearly, and mentored personally. The mature investor learns from Abraham that wealth must serve both purpose and posterity. True financial peace is when you can give freely without fear because your systems and your faith are in divine order. The last sunrise Abraham saw was a gentle one. No desert storm, no loud farewell, just light pouring quietly over the tents at Mamre, gilding the edges of the world he had built from faith. The camp stirred slowly. Servants moved softly, as if they sensed the patriarch's spirit was already halfway between heaven and earth. Abraham lay beneath woven blankets, his breath shallow but peaceful. Beside him sat Isaac, now a man in full command of his father's herds, and Rebekah, whose calm devotion mirrored the steadiness of the promise itself. Outside, the wind sighed through the oaks, and the doves cooed like lullabies. He had lived 175 years, a lifetime of movement, of altars and valleys, of whispers and wonders. Yet in those final moments his mind did not drift to Egypt's gold or Canaan's fields. It wandered instead to a memory of a young man staring at stars, hearing an impossible voice say, "Go." Abraham smiled faintly. "He kept every word," he whispered. Isaac leaned close. "Rest, father." But Abraham's eyes remained open for a while longer. "Don't chase what glitters, son. Chase what grows. And remember, God never measures wealth by what you have, but by what you're willing to give." His hand trembled as he touched Isaac's face. Then his breathing slowed, softened, and ceased, like a candle willingly surrendering to dawn. Isaac closed his father's eyes, his tears mixing with dust and gratitude. The servants wept quietly. Rebecca stood a few steps away, her veil fluttering in the wind, whispering prayers of blessing over the man whose faith had built nations. They buried Abraham beside Sarah in the cave of Machpelah, the same field he had bought with silver years ago. There was something poetic in that. The first true property he ever owned became the soil that kept his promise grounded. Historians record that generations would visit that site, Hebron's quiet valley, as a sacred reminder that faith once walked there in flesh and blood. The patriarch's grave became less a tomb and more a monument to divine economics. Invest in obedience, and your dividends become eternal. Isaac stood beside the sealed cave for a long time. The afternoon light poured over the hills like liquid gold. He remembered every altar his father had built, at Bethel, at Hebron, at Moriah, and understood for the first time that those stones weren't about worship alone. They were wealth statements, physical receipts of trust. He whispered, "Father, your God is my God. Your promise is my inheritance." Then, turning to the camp, Isaac gave orders to distribute food and gifts to the servants and to the local tribes who had long protected their household. "Let all remember," he said, "that the God of Abraham keeps covenant through kindness." A mainstream historical fact, Abraham's descendants, through both Isaac and Ishmael, would populate vast territories stretching from the Mediterranean to Arabia. His influence became the foundation of three world faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. A single man's trust became a global inheritance, a quirky detail often overlooked by historians. Some ancient Jewish texts claim Abraham's tent was left standing for years after his death, tended by Isaac's servants as a symbol of ongoing blessing. Travellers would stop to pray there, believing the air still carried his faith. At night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Isaac sat outside his own tent, watching the same constellations his father once counted. The promise had outlived the man, and somewhere beyond those stars perhaps Abraham was smiling, finally understanding that faith itself had become his greatest fortune. The story of Abraham doesn't end in death. It lingers, like starlight travelling across time. Every act of faith he made, leaving home, trusting promises, sacrificing pride, became a ripple that shaped generations. He was never the richest man of his era by numbers, but by legacy. His wealth wasn't stored in vaults, it lived in the values he passed on, the faith he modelled, and the people who carried his covenant forward. When you think of Abraham tonight, don't just remember the patriarch of old. Remember the investor of eternity. He diversified his life between obedience and vision. He weathered spiritual market crashes, survived emotional famines, and still ended his life in profit, measured not in gold but in peace. So as you close your eyes, breathe slow. Imagine the same stars over your life, the same promise that still glimmers quietly above every believer's journey. You may not own much now, but faith turns small steps into empires. Like Abraham, you are the steward of something invisible yet invaluable. As you rest tonight, may God remind you that true wealth begins with stewardship, not striving. Sweet dreams.